Hi, and welcome back to the Bible, My Cats and I. You know, for a lot of weeks I've been standing in front of this lithograph here, and I thought I would just explain to you what it is so you can appreciate what's behind me. This is a lithograph of a painting that was done by the artist Ghee. He's known for his works in both France and also here on Maui. That's where I live, is Maui, Hawaii. This is a church that's located here in Maui. And I just like it because the people are gathering, and I feel like that's what you and I are doing here too. We're kind of doing church together. And so I thought this might put everybody in the mood. Who knows, I might move around the house later, but I wanted to introduce you to this wonderful artist and this beautiful work. All right, today we are going to be looking at why are there so many different translations to the Bible? I get that question from my students a lot. Why so many different translations? Well, if the history of the Bible isn't too boring for you, we're going to go into that a little bit, but I'm going to try and make it understandable and actually maybe a little exciting so that you can understand what it is that you have in your hands and how miraculous that really is. So first of all, let me explain to you that we don't have an original copy of any of the books in the Bible. You know, the Bible is a library made up of a lot of books and letters and such. We don't have one original writing. And we don't have any, that means we don't have any of the original texts of even the New Testament, which were written most recently. But we do have 4,500 texts, New Testament texts in the Greek language. And we have over 8,000 copies of the text in Latin. And these copies are all sort of, we can compare them to each other. There's actually a scientific method to compare all of these different manuscripts that we have in order to determine which one is most likely closest to the original, so that you can have confidence in what you are reading, that would be pretty much the original writing that the author had in mind. Now, something really important happened in the 20th century, in the mid-20th century. You may have heard of the Qumran texts or the Dead Sea Scrolls. See, these were ancient texts that were found preserved in jars, basically in a cave in Qumran. And as they were pulled out, they're just fragments now after so many thousands of years. They're about 2,000 years old at the time, almost. And while they weren't original texts, they were obviously very early copies of some of the texts that we have in the scripture. And so we could take some of these fragments from almost 2,000 years ago and compare them to the modern translations that we have today, or the more recent texts that we have today. Compare them side by side and see, you know, has this game, like the game telephone, happened where the words over the centuries have changed? Or does it look like we have pretty much the same? And that's why these were so important, is they showed that what we have today compares very, very closely. So obviously, the manuscripts that we call the Bible have been copied very, very carefully, to the point where today there aren't very many changes or very, very many differences between the texts that we have today, the different manuscripts that we can compare. So this is a very, very important. I have a slide here of one particular fragment that they found in Qumran, so that you could see what we're working with. Just a few words, but it was enough for us to be able to compare to what we have today and confirm that we have really good translations today. And you know, majority of the texts that we have in the Greek especially are written in what we call uncials. So it's like, imagine all of the letters are capital letters and they're all scrunched up together. Here's a slide that's an example in English of what it might be like to see what we have in the Greek. And I'm gonna try and read this to you. You can try and read along too. But basically it says, I want you to know, brethren, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the Gospels. Oh, here's a problem. See how that looks like it's plural? No, gospel, so that it has become known. Okay, it's very difficult to read this particular thing because, first of all, the letters aren't divided, and the letters are all capitals, and they're broken in two at the end of the line and started again at the beginning of the next line, and so it's very difficult reading. It takes a bit of skill in order to read these. And something else to know is that a lot of the manuscripts that we have, they're written in columns like this. Here's a picture of 4 columns. So this was what you would be, this is what you would come across in some of the ancient manuscripts. By the way, I should mention that slide that I was trying to read earlier was from Philippians, from the letter of Philippians written by Paul. All right, so let's look at the history of translation, shall we? Oh boy, what an incredible subject. No, but really it actually is. See, copying is a really difficult task, to copy one manuscript in the same language to another one and make sure that it's the same. But it's a whole different thing to try and translate something from one language into another. A person who translates has to make a lot of decisions as to what they think is the best way to really get the idea over into another language. We first find this in what we call the Septuagint, or sometimes it's called LXX. That comes from the 70 Jewish scholars, septa, 70 Jewish scholars that came together and translated the Jewish Hebrew scriptures into Greek. This was done in Alexandria in Egypt. So it was done about sometime in the 2nd century BC, before the Common Era. And so this is actually the text that the disciples of Jesus would have been familiar with, because Greek was pretty much the common language at the time. We have quotes of Jesus speaking in Aramaic, but Greek was pretty much the language that was common at the time. And so, as I said, this would be the text that the disciples were familiar with. Now, quite a bit later, in about 400 AD, so almost 600 years later, there was this guy by the name of, you may have heard of it, Jerome, and he translated the Hebrew texts into Latin, so not into Greek. He translated them now into Latin. So remember I mentioned how we have 8,000 scriptures, manuscripts in Latin, and so all of those would have been sometime after this date, right? Sometime after 400 AD is where we have those manuscripts coming from. So this is an excellent translation. Ran into a few little problems. One of the most famous ones is, if you take a look at this is a statue that was created by Michelangelo of Moses, and there's something odd about Moses, isn't there? Look at his head. He's got some horns. This actually comes from Jerome's Latin Vulgate translation of Exodus, chapter 34, verse 29. Moses was coming down off of the mountains. He had to cover his face with a veil because his face shone. Now, here's where the problem came in. That word for to shine like that, or having rays of light in the Hebrew is karan. But when the Hebrew is written, it didn't include the vowel sounds. And so Jerome, we think probably mistakenly read that as keren, using different vowels in there. And that word keren means horns. So that's why in the Vulgate, it reads that Moses had horns. Not that his face was shining, but that he had horns. And it was based on this Latin Vulgate reading that Michelangelo used in order to create this sculpture of Moses. Isn't that interesting? But all in all, it was still a very good translation, and it's been used in the church ever since. Now, skip ahead a little bit further, another 400 years to around 800 AD, the 9th century AD. There was a lot going on in the world at that time, and there was a lot of destroying manuscripts and destroying things that were written. But we find on the island of Ireland that there were a lot of monks sitting quietly and copiously copying manuscripts. I mentioned in another video that one of my favorite books is called How the Irish Saved Civilization by Thomas Cahill. And he talks about this. He talks about how the Irish were copying these important documents. Not all of them were the Bible, but they certainly did copy the Bible. And they did a beautiful job. And to the point of, having to count letters across a line and in row and in column in order to make sure that they had exactly the right words and hadn't skipped any. They would count the words on a page, etc. Not only that, but they did some amazing other things. And this is an example of some of what's called the illuminated Bible document that was done by Irish monks. This particular page is called the he rho page because it has the Greek letters he and rho, which represent Jesus. So just an intricate artistic rendering here. So this is how carefully these Irish monks translated, made copies of the manuscripts of some of these translations of the Bible. Very good. Then skip ahead. Well, around the same time, actually, there was some work being done by some Jewish scholars once again, and they took the Hebrew Bible and they created what we call the Masoretic text. And so what I'm going to show you here is a page of my own Hebrew Bible, and it is based on the Masoretic text. It includes all this notation down at the bottom of the page that explains which manuscripts were used or whether there were some other manuscripts that maybe read a little bit differently, so that you can know as you're reading through this, you might know that, there were some differences in some other manuscripts, but so you can make your own decision as to which one you think is the right rendering. This is a brilliant work, and so much of what has been done since the 9th century has been based on these Masoretic texts. We rely on it a lot in order to bring all these different ancient manuscripts together and compare them. Well, eventually, there were 4 main locations where manuscripts were originated. 4 schools, we'll call them. There was the Alexandrian texts, there's the Syrian texts, there's the Byzantine texts, and then there are the Western texts. I don't need you to, totally memorize all of that, but I tell you that to tell you this. Later on came this guy called Erasmus. Again, you may have heard of the guy's name. It was the name of a ship in a famous novel, Shogun. Anyway, it was based on his name, the Erasmus. In 1516, Erasmus created the first Greek printed Bible. And he based his Greek printed Bible on the Byzantine school. The Byzantine text that he had, okay? So there might have been some minor differences here and there, none of them really doctrinal, but I'm going to come back to Erasmus's printing of the Greek text later because it plays in just a little bit later in history. Okay, that was in the 1500s. I'm going to step back just a little bit again to the 1300s. There was this guy by the name of John Wycliffe, and his push, and the reason why he was really controversial at the time, was that he was saying, yes, it is true that the church is the only one that can interpret the Bible. And the reason why he was agreeing with that was people like you and me did not have copies of the Bible. First of all, it would have been way too expensive because they were being handwritten at the time. There was no printing press in the 1300s. But also, the Pope, there was only one church. It was there was the Orthodox Church as well by that time. But for the majority was the Roman Catholic Church, and the Pope was considered to be the authority and the only one who could interpret the texts correctly. So John Wycliffe comes around and he says, no, the church, it is true, the church is the only one who can interpret the text, but the church is made up of all believers. And so, therefore, it is all believers who should be able to interpret the text. And the Bible should be put, like originally, back into the hands of the people. That was his argument. Well, as I said, he was very controversial. And then a little bit later, about 100 years later, came John Huss in the 1400s. So basically, he was saying that the Bible is the final authority, not the Pope. And it is the authority by which every Christian should be judged, including the Pope. Well, he was burned at the stake for that. And here we come back. Remember I told you I was going to refer back to Erasmus? So we're back into the 1500s. And now we've got Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther was pretty much the father of what we call the Reformation. So this is when the Protestant church came about and sort of split off from the Roman Catholic Church. One of Luther's pushes was that he too believed that the Bible should be in the hands of the people. And so he took Erasmus's text, the Byzantine text, the printed Greek text. Remember, he'd used the Byzantine Greek translation for his printed Bible, and Luther used that in order to translate the Bible into German, into what was considered the language of the people at the time, and this was huge. All right, then, later on, we come to Tyndale. John Tyndale was influenced by Wycliffe and Luther, and he used the Hebrew and the Greek translations in order to come together with an English translation, an amazing English translation. Now, this is the guy who came out with the controversial statement against the Pope, saying that when he was done, basically, the plowboy would know more about the scriptures than you, speaking to the Pope. Yikes. So, yeah, he was executed by strangulation for that. I want to share these men with you and their work with you because I want you to appreciate just what it took for this Bible to come into your hands in an English translation that you can understand. People lost their lives over this, and it was extremely controversial, but how magnificent, how wonderful. Then, again, a little bit moving forward, in the 1600s, about 1611, that's when we come across this translation called the King James Bible. Now, it was based on another translation that was very similar to Erasmus's translation. It was done by the Elzevir brothers, and it's called the Textus Receptus. Anyway, that was the text that was used to translate into the King James Version. A beautifully translated Bible. Just authoritative, really wonderful. But we have some problems with it. And the problems are this: it was written in Old English. English has changed over the centuries. And so, for instance, it would be like, it's a lot like reading Shakespeare. You know, that was done around the same time. Shakespeare was written around the same time as the King James Bible, very close. How easy is it for you to just pick up Shakespeare and start reading? Have you ever tried that? Kind of difficult. It usually needs a little bit of help, a little bit of translation, or at least the expression of an actor to help you to understand what it is that he's saying. Even if his English is your first language, it's still kind of difficult. And so the King James translation with the these and the thous, and even some certain words that aren't used anymore, it makes it very difficult. Here's an example, the way words change. The word nice. Okay, we think about nice as being, oh, sweet, wonderful. Isn't that nice? You know, it's a wonderful thing. It's a good thing. Nice in the King James Version means kind of simple, kind of stupid even. It has that kind of thing. So words change. Now I want you to take a look at this slide. This sort of gives a summary as to why we have so many new translations now. We know how we've gotten to this point where we have our English translation and we have the King James translation, but now we know we have a lot more translations. Oh my goodness. NIV and the NASB and the Message and so many. Why do we have so many different translations? Well, here are a few reasons. First, we have the discovery of more accurate texts in the Greek and Hebrew. I mean, we saw that when we discovered the Qumran documents, and that really helped us to find really more, possibly more accurate texts. There have been changes in the English language. I say this, it's really interesting because there's a particular story about, even as recently as in the 1960s, and probably even more recently than that, the Vatican decided to change some of the words into text because, well, quite frankly, again, the meaning of words had changed. And so, for instance, they decided to change the translation of what was taken in war. In the Old Testament talks about war and how they, after they went in and killed everybody in a village, they were able to take some things from there. And so the Catholic Church decided to change the translation to spoils of war because the word that was being used before was booty. And since then, booty has taken on a whole new meaning, right? So so in order to avert any giggles in the middle school range of students, they decided to change the text, change the word so that the original meaning of the text would come across better. Okay, so changes in the English language. Also, emphasis on intelligibility. This is like, the Message is a brilliant translation. Eugene Peterson has done a very scholarly work, and he's being recognized more and more than he was originally for his scholarly work in translating into much more street language, so it's much more intelligible. I actually have a Bible that's called the Jesus Book, and it's a translation into Pidgin English. I told you I live in the islands, and it's a serious work. A lot of people look at the text and think, oh, how funny is that? But no, it's a serious work, and it actually makes the Bible more intelligible for people who speak Pidgin English. All right, new meaning of biblical terms. That's kind of related to changes within the English language. So finally, we have improved interpretation, and basically we just know more about language now than we used to. There's more study of it, more scientific study, and we have the world is a bigger place. It's more global. It's a lot easier to find people who speak two different languages fluently, and so are able to translate from one into another, just in a way that's easier to understand. And so we just are doing a better job. Now, in summary, why have I given you all this information? I hope I've made it somewhat interesting to you, but where do you sit now when you open your Bible and you have it on your lap? I'm hoping that you have a greater appreciation, A, for what it went through to get there to your lap in your own language, and B, that you can sit and feel that you can have confidence in those words that you have. Yes, they've been copied again and again. And yes, there might be some minor nuances, but there's been so much scholarship and so much comparison of the different manuscripts and stuff so that you can really have confidence. Everything's been pointed out. All of the differences, scholars know, oh my gosh, there was a word missing there, but we recognize that, and that's okay. And I want to say, with confidence, there has been nothing that's been found in the Bible that is of any doctrinal significance. There might be just little minor changes or, little nuances here and there, but there's nothing of major doctrinal importance. So what you have, you can have confidence in it. Now, you can go out, you don't even have to go down to the bookstore. You don't have to try and order things online. Just get online. Go to, any one of the websites that has multiple Bible translations. Try and read some of them. Find which one seems to be the easiest for you to read so that some of this will make sense, okay? You can have your King James translation, certainly. That's wonderful. And if you like to read that, that's great. But if that doesn't make sense to you, go to something that's a little more modern. Today's modern translation. There's a myriad of them. Just take a look and see what seems to speak best to you. And so with that, may I say, may grace and peace be with you. You have a great week.